Hello, and welcome to Module 3 of the Leadership and Culture Academy. In this module, we'll be diving deeper into the Culture is King principle of implementation leadership, and we'll introduce you to the IDEATE framework for culture change. It's one thing to understand organizational culture, and it's another thing to change culture. The IDEATE framework will help us with this change. Before we jump in, let's do a little recap of what we've covered so far. In Module 1, we focused on cognitive collaboration with the emergenetics assessment tool. We uncovered how we can collaborate differently based on the way our brains are wired. Emergenetics is the vehicle to engage in cognitive collaboration. It's a personal leadership assessment based in the neurosciences that helps us understand some of our preferences in the way that our brain is structurally wired and the way that we are socialized as human beings. This gives us an opportunity to understand our brain and how we operate. And even better, it helps us understand others' brains from a really objective standpoint. The key here being that we want to use the differences in the way that we think as a strength towards collaboration. In Module 2, we introduced you to 6 of the 10 principles in the implementation leadership practice model. We learned about trusting the vision and how the leadership mindset is contagious. We talked about how Murphy hates us and how as leaders we need to accept that what can go wrong will. And we talked about building Murphy into our implementation plans. We talked about being comfortable being uncomfortable, and that we need to find comfort in the chaos so that we can get beyond the fear zone and into the growth zone. In Adapt or Die, we learned about diagnosing challenges to discern between technical and adaptive problems so that we can match the right solution to the problem at hand. We talked about failing forward and failing often, embracing trial and error, and how failure is perceived as a virtue and perfection as a vice. Then we wrapped up with talking about how culture is king and how it is always upstream from our implementation strategy and outcomes. So we've studied our personal emergenetics profiles and learned about others and their profile. Hopefully, you have learned that being different is a strength in the world of cognitive collaboration. And so far, we've talked about 6 of the 10 principles that make up implementation leadership, or our change leadership acumen. Now, we're going to focus on the organizational science and culture change acumen. As we mentioned previously, there are high rates of failure with the implementation of new innovations and change initiatives at the organizational level. And the research demonstrates that 70% of change initiatives fail, never actualizing their intended outcomes, regardless of whether or not that was top-down change, bottom-up change, or critical mass change. In this module, we'll explore how culture impacts our ability to implement change initiatives and what you can do, both as an organization and as a state, to ensure the effective implementation of the quality assurance unit and its work. This module will help us to work on the organizational culture versus just working inside of it. As Glenn mentioned in the previous webinar, culture is always upstream from strategy. Strategy is our evidence-based practice, it's our program, it's our innovation, it's the quality assurance unit. Strategy is also our implementation. Culture drives the degree to which our organizations will experience success or failure with this project. And for us, this project is about treatment matching and using a structured decision-making framework to help our clients succeed. It doesn't matter if our goal is to maximize excellence or just to comply with the law or both. All of that is downstream from culture. Remember that culture starts with the inputs plus mindset. The inputs are the people in our organization. It's all of our practices and our habits and our policies and procedures. It's all of the tangible things that we put into our organization, like money and tasks and processes. Then you have to add in the mindset. Mindset is the collective beliefs, attitudes, and values of the members in our organization. It's the organizational norms from a mindset perspective. It's what you have to do around your organization to fit in. Culture is the sum of these two things: all of your people, all of your habits, all of your processes, plus the way that people think, and the way that they believe, and what their values are, and their why. So you take the sum of that and you raise it to the power of dialogue and interaction. Inputs plus mindset is strengthened or weakened by the type of dialogue and the way that people interact in an organization. What's being talked about at the water cooler? What's the leader talking about? What mindset is the leader putting out on that emotional contagion network about change? We can change culture by changing all of this. We have to change the people. We have to change the practices. We have to change the mindset. And we have to change the way that we dialogue and interact when it comes to culture. Because dialogue and interaction has an exponential power effect on the inputs and the mindset. Organizations all have the same ingredients. They've got people, they've got processes, they've got rules. They also all have mindsets. But what's different here is that from organization to organization, those beliefs, attitudes, and values are different. Same ingredients, just different proportions. And the dialogue and interaction varies from organization to organization as well. So when we're trying to identify and diagnose our culture, we have to consider all of these ingredients that make up our culture. Now, for all of you creative brains out there that are digging this metaphor track that we're on, when thinking about changing culture, it can be helpful to think of it kind of like a chemistry experiment. It starts at the bottom there. You can see the dialogue and interaction flame flickering. When we change the way we dialogue and interact about culture, it starts to activate or change the inputs in the mindset of our organizations. The flask and the stopper on the flask represents our boundaries. As we start to explore different dialogue and as we start to explore different mindsets, we have to also change our boundaries. We have to change what's acceptable, what the rules say, or how the rules are applied. Changing culture starts when the dialogue and interaction change. It's important to remember that what we focus on through our dialogue and interaction becomes the culture, impacting the mindsets and habits of those within it. And that culture can help or hinder our implementation efforts. In the last module, you started to identify and diagnose your culture by using the Organizational Culture Assessment Instrument, or OCAI. The OCAI is a well-established, validated tool developed by Kim Cameron and Robert Quinn at the University of Michigan. It was designed to measure both the current and desired culture profile within an agency. It asks you about the current culture you're working in and what your ideal culture looks like. There really isn't a right culture, but rather a culture that works with your change strategy. It's also a quick way to get visual feedback about your culture from staff, as it's not a difficult assessment to complete. The research on organizations has been mixed in that it's been really hard to identify, early in the days of organizational research, what contributes to organizational performance. And there's been a lot of research done since the 1950s around what it is that drives organizational success. The researchers found all these different components, and some typologies and constant themes started to emerge. We understand that some of this may be duplicative of what we've reviewed during the live session together, but these points are important to reiterate before we talk about the IDEATE framework. The pioneers behind the OCAI and the competing values framework found that any organization is in some kind of tension between an internal focus and an external focus. An internal focus is an organization that's focused on itself, focused on its own people, and keeping itself intact. This part of our organizations integrate complex, abstract, or disorganized information and organize it down to a more concrete solution. It's similar to the green or structural trait from emergenetics, where structural thinkers focus on the logistics, details, and the sequence of otherwise abstract information from the yellow or conceptual part of the human brain of others, aka cognitive collaboration. Then there's the other point of tension, which is being externally focused on external customers and external agencies, maybe even focused on the outside environment. And those organizations that are externally focused are really more focused on diverging from status quo. They're focused on being a little bit different than holding themselves to being the same. They focus on the future and innovation and experimentation. This is much like the yellow, conceptual trait in emergenetics, working against the structural green trait, in collaboration and in conflict. Here, you start to see some parallels between the OCAI and emergenetics, as they both have competing traits and values that require both conflict and collaboration. There's another point of tension that exists here on the vertical axes between flexibility and stability, or between discretion and control. We're always in some point of conflict between whether we're going to be flexible and adaptable, and we're about experimentation and those kinds of things, and whether our staff have a lot of discretion and judgment and autonomy in their decision making and what we do. The thing that pulls tension against that is a desire to be more about stability and to have controlled processes and have a lot of predictability. So, organizations struggle between being flexible and giving their staff a lot of discretion, or being more about stability and having more processes that establish organizational control. When we put these two axes together, we now have the competing values framework. The competing values framework is an underlying framework that lives underneath the OCAI to show you how your organization performs on these 2 points of tension. There are some organizations that are internally focused and flexible. These organizations are about giving their people discretion, being flexible, and maybe even being more collaborative because they really value their people. Those organizations that are both internally focused and flexible, we can think of those as the collaborate culture. It's the culture that's focused on using everyone's mind in the organization to make a decision or to make things work. We also have organizations that are still about flexibility and they're still about giving staff discretion, but they're a little more externally focused. They're about diverging or differentiating from status quo. We can think of this type of culture as the create culture. These organizations are a little more cutting edge. They're more experimental, adaptable, and creative because they're focused on diverging from the status quo. We also have organizations that are internally focused and also focused on stability and control. They're really focused on predictable processes, predictable rules, predictable operational policies, and really protecting some of those policies because they're internally focused. They're about protecting and holding stable in some of those internal processes. You can think of this culture as the control culture. Some may even call it the hierarchical culture. Then there are organizations that are more about stability and control, but also externally focused. Those organizations are looking out to the market, and they're really about exercising control over their environment, and they're focused on stretching the targets. They're focused about change, but they're also focused on capturing things in order to stay stable as an organization. They focus on their market share, or these audacious goals, and try to really have an athletic type of approach to their work. These are fast moving organizations that like to hustle. So, any organization has attributes in all four of these profiles. We're always in points of tension between these four areas. And you've now started to paint the picture of your organization with the OCAI in figuring out how much of your organization is collaborative, how much is creative, how much is competitive, or how much of it is about control. Now, the IDEATE framework is designed to help you prioritize culture in your work by identifying it, diagnosing and dialoguing about it regularly, and using an embrace and avoid strategy to work on culture in your agency. IDEATE stands for identify, dialogue and diagnose deeply, explore alternatives, and the 10 principles of implementation leadership. We will be going through each area and then applying these concepts in our live session together. We've already completed the first part of the IDEATE framework by completing the OCAI and identifying your organization's culture profile. Keep in mind that this is your individual perception of your organizational culture. In a perfect world, everyone in your organization would complete the OCAI using their own perceptions, and we would be able to generate an aggregate report and a more complete picture of your organization in its entirety. For the purposes of this project, we'll be focusing on the OCAI that you already have completed. Now, unfortunately, for all of us, organizational culture change is not a checklist. It's not something that we can apply in a linear, step-by-step process to lead us to change. It doesn't have a clear beginning, nor a clear and discernible end. It's a phenomenon that requires experimentation, and as such, it's important to think indefinitely about our culture and how it functions in our organization. To think indefinitely is to embrace that we should always be in some state of change around our culture, that we must always be identifying our culture, diagnosing it, embracing those parts of it that are supporting our work, and avoiding those that are not. You will learn more about the infinite mindset in the module after this one. As we say, be intentionally infinite. By making culture a priority in your work, you're taking steps towards working on your organization as opposed to just in it. By thinking indefinitely and thinking cyclically about how we go about culture change. In the next phase of the IDEATE framework, we're looking to diagnose our culture using the outcome of our OCAI assessment. So, how do we use those results to begin to have deep dialogue about our culture and where we want to grow? Rarely does your organization fit into just one of the OCAI culture profile areas. In most cases, organizational cultures have one or two dominant areas, but also have some attributes from all four types. It's unlikely that you'll see an OCAI profile where the organization is only a compete culture or entirely a collaborate culture. And it's important to note that there's no right culture profile. Rather, there are culture profiles that better fit your purpose and what you're trying to accomplish. For instance, when organizations are small or just starting out, you often see a preference for a collaborative culture profile, where a smaller group of people are working together through consensus and group work. As agencies grow, they often embrace more of a control culture profile as they develop policies and procedures that provide some structure and consistency to the work. All the culture typologies have value, and organizations with great cultures are often well balanced in all four areas and can be flexible to shift based upon their needs at the given time. If you think back to your OCAI profile and the two kites that you created to represent your current and desired culture profiles, what you should notice is that in order to grow or stretch in one area, you have to shrink in another. Said another way, if your culture profile is most heavily represented in the create area, but you need more structure and consistency in order to grow, then as an organization, you would need to embrace some of the control culture attributes while avoiding or shrinking some of the create attributes. Or if your agency is getting ready to innovate and do some new things, you likely need to embrace more create and compete culture attributes while de emphasizing aspects of control. Let's dig into this a bit further by taking another review of the culture profiles and their primary characteristics. Let's start with the create culture profile. This is the yellow profile that's externally focused and highly flexible. Sometimes we call this an ad hoc culture. It's a very innovative and transformative culture that's held together by a really audacious vision, a focus on the future, and really embraces diverse ideas and thoughts. If this culture profile had a billboard, it would say that the best way to kill an idea is to develop a policy or procedure. So, this culture profile values ideas and creativity and puts less value on rules because that can really limit what's possible. The create culture profile invites risk. It's really dynamic and likes to experiment. The leaders in this part of our culture are the idea people, the champions for change. They're not the aggressive hard drivers. They aren't the rule makers, but rather they're the ones thinking about the opportunities that change could bring and how to go about doing that. An important attribute of the create culture is the leadership approach. Notice that in the yellow create culture, the leader is the inspiration and idea person. They champion change, and that's their role, is to catalyze status quo. The yellow or create culture profile is really a change minded, flexible, agile, future focused, innovative, dynamic, and risk friendly culture. Now, the culture profile that's competitive to the yellow is the green culture or the control culture. This part of our culture would construct a billboard that says there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way to do things, and maybe nothing in between. It's held together by predictable processes, by logistics and rules, structure and order. This aspect of our leadership is about creating predictable results through rules and guidelines, having capable processes that can be depended on to work every time in the right way. In the create or yellow profile, decision making is decentralized, and individuals are providing a lot of autonomy to create and take risks. Whereas in the green or control profile, decision making is more centralized, concentrated around a small group of individuals. The control aspects of our culture bring with it a low tolerance for errors and deviating from the norm. And the leader in this part of our culture functions as an organizer, a monitor, and a coordinator of all of the rules and processes that are created. The value here is really about conforming to the rules, whereas in the yellow culture, it's about departing from the rules. And here we begin to see the push and pull of culture within an organization. Where we may be interested in changing some things, the control aspects of our culture will want to protect the status quo and keep us aligned with the rules and regulations. A push and pull situation can emerge between these two facets of our organizational culture, which really require us to be agile, able to stretch towards a certain part of our culture as needed. This tension is also why we need to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Because tension is natural, and change requires tension, and tension requires stress for change to occur. Now, think emergenetics for a second. Remember the green structural thinking trait? That part of our brain that likes logistics, order, rules, and step by step procedures and orderly sequencing? Sounds a lot like the control culture within the OCAI, doesn't it? As leaders of change, the way we think influences the way that we lead and influences our culture. Green emergenetics mindset can result in green culture. Yellow emergenetics mindset can result in yellow culture. Go back to that equation where culture is the sum of the inputs plus mindset. If we can change the dialogue, we can change the mindset and change the culture. In the compete or market aspects of our culture, we're all about the hustle and finding ways to meet our goals as quickly as possible. You can think of this culture profile as an athletic one, focused on the action, ambitious goals, and charging forward to stretch targets. Because it's externally focused, value is placed on doing better than others, getting across the finish line faster, and ultimately being the best at something. Leaders in this area would have a billboard that says it's better to aim high and miss the mark than aim low and hit it. In this area of our organization, notice the leadership focus. The leadership here is a hard driver and hard worker. They direct the aggressive mindset to reach and stretch goals. This leader is always measuring progress towards goals, looking at cost benefit ratios, analyzing data to see how things are going, and measuring productivity targets over and over again. Sounds a little like the blue emergenetics analytical trait, somewhat, doesn't it? The thinking leader, who always uses data and analysis to see how things are going. The analytical leader in a compete culture will always be using data and progress markers to gauge their success toward continually growing goals and ambitions. If this leadership is mindless and neglects the people and relationships, or the red areas, then people may feel neglected, and there will be a tension between the blue thinking and culture styles with the red ones. The blue can challenge the red and vice versa, just like emergenetics. Then finally, there's the collaborate culture profile, which is the opposite to the blue, or the compete culture. The collaborate aspects of our culture are internally focused and about flexibility. Some people think of this like a family, where people are empowered to come together to make decisions, and there's a real sense of we in the work. This aspect of organizational culture is held together by the people, their shared values, and by valuing consensus. Sometimes this part of our culture can be slower moving because it will avoid making decisions until consensus is achieved. The billboard for this culture profile would be that handshakes are more powerful than contracts. There's high trust and therefore little need for things like contracts and rules. Rather, we come together because we want to and because we value the work when it's done together. Sounds just like the social or red trait of emergenetics, doesn't it? Red thinking can result in red leadership, which focuses on trust and building relational capital. This takes time away from the blue needs to hustle, hustle, hustle to get those ambitious goals met. There is tension, conflict, and a need to find comfort in the chaos of change. Dialogue is a critical piece in the IDEATE framework, and really the only way to ensure that you're identifying and diagnosing your culture in a comprehensive way. It's also a part of the solution should you identify that you want to make shifts in one direction or another. So, before we dive into how to embrace alternatives to your culture, let's review some pro tips about culture dialogue in your organization. One tip is to use an implementation team to support culture change work. An implementation team is a specific group of people who are tasked with focusing on the organizational culture. or other parts of the implementation work, and really digging into diagnosing and developing iterative solutions. The research about implementation teams is pretty compelling. That change is more likely to happen when you use a team of individuals as opposed to a single person, or through general committee work. While we won't get into all of the inner workings of an implementation team here, we will be dedicating some time in the upcoming live virtual retreat to talk more about this. A change circle is similar to an implementation team, where half of the members are permanent, while other members rotate across the organization, so you have fresh eyes and fresh perspectives on the work. No matter how you design your implementation team, what's most important is that you're intentional about including diverse mindsets and perspectives. Think back to our discussions about cognitive collaboration and how you can create teams with cognitive diversity to ensure the best results. It's also important to remember that dialogue is a process and not an event. It's persistent reinforcing of the right thing to do, while also de emphasizing the other things that get in the way of change. Said another way, it's embracing the things we need to grow and avoiding the things that we need to shrink in our culture. It's critical to keep ongoing dialogue about our culture and our change work. Remember, this is not a linear checklist driven process. Rather, it's an ongoing and cyclical process where we are consistently identifying and dialoguing about our culture. By doing this, we can turn something abstract like culture into something concrete by having intentional conversations, using the OCAI to help us identify and diagnose our culture, and then embracing alternatives based on what we're striving for. Embracing alternatives is derived from the competing values framework, where in order to stretch ourselves or grow, different aspects of our culture we must simultaneously shrink. As such, the Embrace Avoid tools help us to start the process by focusing on specific attributes of our culture that we would like to embrace or avoid. There are 4 tools in this framework, and the first one is the OCAI, which you've already completed. Next, we'll discuss tension mapping and provide a culture dialogue tool that you can use to do this work. Then we'll get into part 3 with the Embrace and Avoid tools. And finally, we'll tie it back to your emergenetics profile, which we'll get back into during our live retreat time together. And remember, there isn't a quick fix or panacea for culture change. We can't approach culture change technocratically. There's no checklist or specific to-dos that once you check the box, you're done working on your culture. You also can't legislate culture change. It's a process, not an event, and is always evolving. Culture is an adaptive phenomenon and one that requires iteration and experimentation. While changing culture requires changing practices in and of itself doesn't change culture. Culture change is inputs and mindset and dialogue. So let's get started with the IDEATE tension mapping tool, which is one of the attachments in the email that you received with this webinar. This is a simple tool to explore how you can shift and embrace different aspects of your culture based on what you're striving for. This is work that can be done with your implementation team or change circle, and this tool will help you start to learn how to think about what things about your current culture get in the way of your desired culture with the OCAI. If you don't already have copies of these tools printed out and in front of you, please pause the video now to download and print off copies before proceeding. What you'll find in this tool is one page that maps out the collaborate and compete profiles, and then a second page with the control and create profiles. These culture profiles are diametrically opposite to one another, so as you think about what you want to embrace on one side of the page, you can also identify what you need to shrink to make space for that. So you'll see a list of items on the left side of the page and a list of items on the right side of the page. What you want to do is start to draw some lines between the characteristics of the collaborate profile that compete with the characteristics within the compete profile. For example, towards the bottom of the screen, you can see a description of the leader within a collaborate culture as the connector, mentor, and team builder. And that competes with leadership that are hard drivers, directors, and someone who takes on an aggressive approach and mindset in the compete culture on the right side. These characteristics are in competition with one another. So by drawing a line between the two, you can start to see some of the shifts that you can make to stretch and grow your culture, depending on what you're focused on. The work of the implementation team or change circle is to talk about those differences. Identify where they see this in day-to-day interactions. Which leaders act more red and which ones act more blue. Your team should use this tool in a group setting. Get to know each other from your emergenetics profiles first. Then use this tool to start dialogue about the things that maximize your ideal culture while needing to minimize the competing traits. Now let's look at another example. Notice that the red trait of this tool says cohesive and morale driven with a focus on employee engagement and satisfaction. Say that this is your target for growth and change. You want to grow your focus on staff and morale. But the blue part of your culture may need to focus externally on stakeholders, the legislature, customers, contractors, or other people and their expectations of you. How might you grow one while shrinking another? Or may you have to shrink or avoid something else about the blue that gets in the way of your goal to improve employee morale and staff engagement? What does that look like in the next year in your organization? That is the dialogue that needs to happen with your implementation team, using the OCAI results and this tool in the IDEATE framework as your guide. Think of this tool as a dialogue agenda for your implementation. When your team decides to dialogue about culture change, this gives you specific and concrete talking points to work through with your team. Do we need to think more red to earn more red in our culture? How and where might we think less blue in order to implement this new idea that we have? And then you can do the same thing between the control and create profiles, doing your best to identify, in concrete terms, how you see these characteristics playing out in the day-to-day operation of your organization. Who exemplifies which characteristics and how? Remember, this is simply a dialogue tool. It's designed to get the conversation going, to help teams to identify how these things play out in practice, which will begin to illuminate change targets, gaps in mindsets and approaches, and help to identify what to embrace and what to avoid. This dialogue process is incredibly important to your culture and to your implementation. We are certain that once your team uses this tool to start the dialogue of culture change, you will start to identify things you need to embrace and the things that you need to avoid. Another way to think about this metaphorically is to think about a speedometer. You might have some things that you want to appreciate or depreciate. Depreciate meaning things that you want to shrink in value, and appreciate meaning things that you want to grow in value. So you might have some aspects of your culture that you want to depreciate or shrink a little bit in order to grow something else a lot. As you get clearer on what you want to embrace and what you want to avoid, you can start to think about it on a dial, where there are some things that you want to appreciate or grow, and others that you want to depreciate or shrink. And so step one is to identify and diagnose where things are at, and then dialogue deeply about where you see your culture in practice, so that you can then determine what you want to strengthen and what you want to avoid. Use this dial in the next tools that you'll see to estimate how much you need to grow or shrink in each area. Do you need to grow a little or a lot? Use the meter to get consensus from your team about the degree of change that needs to happen. Again, this is just for sake of healthy dialogue and interaction, so that you can discuss and debate how much change needs to happen. So with the Embrace Avoid tool, embrace essentially means what are the mindset attributes that we want to embrace, or what are those that we want to grow? If you think back to that iceberg metaphor we used previously, the mindset and the habits are those things that live below the surface, but are the core drivers to successful implementation. So as leaders, we need to focus on the mindset and habits that we need to change. Simultaneously, you'll use the term avoid to identify the things that you need to shrink in your culture to change the profile. These are the mindset areas, the habits, and the practices that need to maybe go away in order to make room for the new things in your culture. This tool is designed to help you think through what you want to keep and strengthen and what you want to avoid with intention. Your change strategy should come from your own team, your own leadership, and this tool is designed to help you have the conversation and identify the things that are working well and those that need to change. The Evaluate Alternatives tool has 4 pages. One to grow the red and shrink the blue, one to grow the blue and shrink the red, one to grow the yellow and shrink the green, and then one to grow the green and shrink the yellow, which you can see there on the right. You may need all 4 tools or just one, depending on how much change and where you need to change. For example, if you only need to grow the yellow and shrink the green for starters, then you can use that specific page and not the others for now. But if you need to also grow the red and shrink the blue, you'll use that page as well. Rarely will all 4 pages be needed, but there is one page for each scenario, depending on where and how you need to grow or shrink. Now, remember when you took the OCAI and you mapped out your current culture and also your ideal culture? This is your focal area for the embrace and avoid tools. Your kite diagram shows you where you want to grow and where you need to shrink. And that's how you choose which embrace and avoid tools that you'll use for your team. In our live session together, we'll be going through our Evaluate Alternatives tool, where using prompts, you can identify the areas of your culture that you would like to shift and what you would like to do. And this brings us all the way back to cognitive collaboration and emergenetics from our first week together. Remember that cognitive collaboration requires the inclusion of different mindsets and neuro attributes to create well rounded teams that can work through culture change and other implementation challenges comprehensively. So, for your homework before our live session together, we want you to start diving into both the tension mapping tool and the Evaluate Alternatives tool. Go through the tension mapping tool to identify the competing priorities. What are you starting to identify as areas that you need to grow or shrink? Then, based on your OCAI profile that you completed, work through the Evaluate Alternatives tool. This could be using one page, or maybe it's using all 4. When it comes to your organization's culture and how it impacts the implementation of this project, what are some components that you're identifying that you may need to embrace, and what do you want to avoid? We're looking forward to discussing this further in the next live session, and we'll see you soon.